Chapter 4 Fanaticism of the Martyrs. The next candidates for martyrdom were two young and beautiful girls, whose history we learn from their patron, Eulogius, who seems to have regarded one of these maidens, Flora, with a platonic love mingled with a sort of religious devotion. Flora, the daughter of a Muslim father and a Christian mother, was born at Cordova. She is said to have practiced abstinence even in her cradle. At first, she was brought up as a Muslim and lived in conformity with that faith until, being converted to Christianity about 8 years before this time, and finding the intolerance of her father and her brother unbearable, she deserted her home. But when her brother, in his efforts to discover and reclaim her, persecuted many Christian families whom he suspected of conniving at her escape, she voluntarily surrendered herself to him, saying, "Here I am who you seek, and for whose sake you persecute the people of God. I am a Christian. Do your best to annul that confession. None of your torments will be able to overcome my faith." Her brother, after trying in vain, by alternate threats and blandishments, to bring her back from her error, finally dragged her before the Cadi. And he, hearing her brother's accusation and her own confession, ordered her to be barbarously beaten, and then given up, nearly dead, to her brother. She managed, however, to recover and escaped under angelic guidance. Shortly afterwards, while praying in a church, she was found by Maria, sister of Walabonsus, above mentioned, who had been martyred a few months previously. Their father, being a Christian, converted his unbelieving wife. They came to live at Franio, near Cordova, and their daughter was educated at the nunnery of Clara, near the city, under the care of the abbess Artema. Brooding over her brother's martyrdom, and perhaps, as was so often the case, seeing his glorified spirit in a vision, she left the cloister, determining to follow in his saintly footsteps. While on her way to give herself up, she turned aside into a church to pray, and found Flora there. Together, then, did these devoted girls go forth to curse Muhammad, of whom they probably knew next to nothing, and lose their own lives. The judge, however, pitying their youth and beauty, merely imprisoned them. News of his sister's imprisonment being brought to Flora's brother, he induced the judge to make a further examination of her, and she was brought out of prison before the Cadi, who, pointing to her brother, asked her if she knew him. Flora answered that she did, as her brother according to the flesh. "How is it, then," asked the judge, "that he remains a good Muslim, while you have apostatized?" She answered that God had enlightened her, and, on professing herself ready to repeat her former denunciations of the Prophet, she was again remanded to prison. Here, she and Maria are threatened with being thrown upon the streets as prostitutes, a punishment far worse than the easy death they had desired. This shakes their constancy when they find an unexpected comforter in Eulogius himself, who is now imprisoned for being an encourager and inciter of defiance to the laws. It is strange that he should have been allowed to carry on in the prison itself the very work for which he had been imprisoned. The support of Eulogius enabled these tender maidens to stand firm through another examination, and the judge, proving too merciful or too good a Muslim to carry out the above-mentioned threat, they were led forth to die, November 24th, 851. Before their death, they had promised Eulogius to intercede before the throne of God for his release, which accordingly is brought to pass 6 days after their own execution. An interval of only a little more than a month elapsed before Gumezendus, a priest of the district called Campania, near Cordova, and Servas, a monk, suffered death in the same way, January 13th, 852. There was now a pause for 6 months in the race for martyrdom, and it seemed as if the Church had come to its right mind upon this subject. This, however, was far from being the case. Hitherto, the victims had been almost without exception priests, monks, and nuns, but the next martyrs afford us instances of married couples claiming a share in this doubtful honor. These were Aurelius, son of a Muslim father and a Christian mother, and his wife Sabagatha, or Nathalia, the daughter of Muslim parents, whose father dying, her mother married a Christian and was converted, and Felix and his wife Liliosa. It would seem that with all the harm that was done by this outbreak of fanaticism, some good was also effected in awakening the worldly-minded adherents of Christianity from the spiritual torpor into which they were sinking. For these new martyrs were of the class of hidden Christians, who were now shamed into avowing their real creed. Yet, surely it had been far better if they had been content to live like Christians instead of dying like suicides. In their case, indeed, we find no sudden, irresistible impulse driving them to defy the laws, but a slowly matured conviction that it was their duty, disregarding all human ties, to give themselves up to death. In this resolution they were fortified by the advice and encouragement of Eulogius and Alvar, the latter of whom prudently warns Aurelius to make sure that his courage is sufficient to stand the trial. Sabagatha is persuaded to accompany her husband in his self-destruction, her natural reluctance to leave her children being overcome by Eulogius, who recommends that they should be given over to the care of a monastery, a seasonable vision in which Flora and Maria appear to her clenches her purpose. Meanwhile, a foreign monk from Bethlehem, who being sent on business connected with his monastery to Africa, had crossed over in Spain, impelled by the wild enthusiasm there prevailing, determined to offer himself as a candidate for martyrdom with the 4 persons above mentioned. They then take counsel together how they may best effect their purpose, there being evidently enough difficulty in procuring martyrdom for themselves to show the statements of the apologists that there was a fierce persecution raising to be at least much exaggerated, if not entirely without foundation. The plan decided upon, which the devisers audaciously attributed to the suggestion of God, was that the women should go forth unveiled and with hurried steps to the church, in the hope that such an unwonted sight would direct attention to them and occasion the arrest of the whole number. It fell out as desired, and they were all brought before the judge and interrogated with the usual result, except that the judge on this occasion dismissed them with scornful anger. But George, disappointed at his untoward clemency as they were being led away, broke out with, "Can you not go down to hell without seeking to drag us also thither as your companions?" This incoherent abuse naturally incensed the soldiers, as it was no doubt intended that it should. Accordingly, the prisoners were dragged again before the Cadi, who asked them in a mild tone of remonstrance why they had abandoned the faith of Islam and refused to live, promising them at the same time great rewards if they would become Muslims again. On their refusal, they were remanded for 2 days, which seemed a very long time, so eager were they to die. They pass the time with singing hymns and are blessed with visits of angels and miraculous signs. Their chains drop off, and the jailers dare not again bind those whom Christ himself had loosed. The authorities, now as ever anxious, if possible, to avoid extreme penalties, determined to release George, because they had not themselves heard his blasphemy. He balks their merciful intention by repeating his words on the spot, and he is accordingly led forward and beheaded with the others. July 27, 852. Within a month, Christopher, a monk of Rohana and of Arab lineage, and Leovigild, a monk of Fraga, both being places near Cordova, are executed for the same offense and in the same manner, their dead bodies being nailed to stakes. Well, taking the air in his palace, the king saw these bodies and ordered them to be burnt, and the ashes scattered in the river. The same night, Abdurrahman II was struck down with apoplexy, and the martyr's friends hailed it as a manifest judgment from heaven. He was succeeded by Muhammad I, 852 to 886, a less capable and more bigoted ruler than his father. No sooner was he on the throne than Emila, a deacon, and Jeremiah, a priest, of St. Cyprian's Church near Cordova, following in the footsteps of so many predecessors, came before the Cadi and reviled Muhammad, the former being enabled to do this with the more point and effect, as he was, to a remarkable degree, master of the Arabic language. Emila and Jeremiah won the prize they coveted and were put to death September 15th, 852. The customary prodigy occurred after the execution in describing which the pious eulogist breaks into meter, saying, "They are truly a fallen religion." On the following day occurred an outrage which the most bigoted partisans of the martyrs must have blushed to record. 2 eunuchs, Rogel, a monk of Paraponda near Elvira, and Servio Deo, a eunuch of foreign extraction, forced their way into a mosque, and by way of preaching, as they said, to the assembled worshippers, they reviled their prophet and their religion. Being set upon and nearly torn in pieces by the infuriated congregation, they were rescued by the Cadi, who imprisoned them till such time as their sentence should be declared. They were condemned to have their hands and feet cut off and be beheaded, which sentence was carried into effect. Upon this fresh provocation, the fury and apprehension of the king knew no bounds. He might well be pardoned for thinking that this defiance of the laws and religious fanaticism could only mean a widespread disaffection and conspiracy against the Muslim rule. In fact, as we shall see, the Christians of Toledo raised the banner of revolt in favor of their Cordovan brethren at this very time. Muhammad, therefore, seems to have meditated a real persecution, such as should extirpate Christianity in his dominions. He is said even to have given orders for a general massacre of the males among the Christians, and for the slavery, or worse, of the women if they did not apostatize. But the dispassionate advice of his counselors saved the king from this crime. They pointed out that no men of any intelligence, education, or rank among the Christians had taken part in the doings of the zealots, and that the whole body of Christians ought not to be cut off, since their actions were not directed by any individual leader. Other advisers seem to have diverted the king from his project of a wholesale massacre by encouraging him to proceed legally against the Christians with the utmost rigor, and by this means to cow them into submission. These strong measures apparently produced some effect, for no other executions are recorded for a period of 9 months, when Fandela, a priest of Tabanos, and chosen by the monks of Saint Salvator's monastery to be one of their spiritual overseers, came forward and reviled the prophet, whereupon he was imprisoned and subsequently beheaded, June 13, 1853. His fate awakened the dormant fanaticism of Anastasius, a priest of St. Exelus's church of Felix, a Gaetulian monk of Acala de Henares, and of Digna, a virgin of St. Elizabeth's nunnery at Tabanos, the latter being strengthened in her resolve by a celestial vision, who, pursuing the usual plan, are beheaded the following day, their example being followed by Benildis, a matron, on June 15. The cloisters of Tabanos had furnished so many fanatics that the government now suppressed the place, removing the nuns and shutting them up to prevent others giving themselves up. One of these, however, Columba, sister of Elizabeth and of the abbot Martin, contrived to escape. This Columba had persisted in remaining a virgin, in spite of her mother's efforts to make her marry, which only ceased when the mother died. She now gave herself up and was beheaded, September 17th. Just 1 month later, Pomposa, from the monastery of St. Salvator, Pegnamalar, suffered the same fate. Then there was a pause in these executions, which was not broken till July 11th of the following year, when Abundius, a priest, was martyred. He seems to have really deserved the name of martyr, for he was given up to the authorities by the treachery of others, and did not seek martyrdom. Another similar period elapsed before Amator, priest of Tushi, Tejada, Peter, a monk of Cordova, and Ludovic, a brother of Paul, the deacon, beheaded 4 years before, shared the same fate, April 30th, 855. After nearly a year, Whitesindus, a repentant renegade, Elias, an old priest of Lusitania, and Paul and Isidore, young monks, gave themselves up to execution, April 17th, 856. In June of that year, a more venerable victim was, like Abundius, betrayed to his destruction. This was Agramiras, an old monk, once censor of Cordova, June 28. Exactly 1 month later, Aurea, a virgin and sister of the brothers John and Adolphus, whose martyrdom has been already mentioned, was brought before the magistrate. Descended from one of the noblest Arab families, she had long been left unmolested, though her apostasy to Christianity was well known. She was now frightened into temporary submission, but soon repenting of her compliance and avowing herself truly a Christian, she gained a martyr's crown, July 29th. The next example affords a similar instance of real persecution. Ruderick, a priest whose brother was a Muslim, unadvisedly intervened as a peacemaker in a quarrel in which his brother was engaged. With the usual fate of peacemakers, he was set upon by both parties and nearly killed. In fact, his brother supposed him to be quite dead, and had the body carried through the town, proclaiming that his brother had become a Muslim before his death. However, Ruderick recovered and made his escape, but, being obliged to return to Cordova, met his brother, who immediately brought him before the Cadi on a charge of apostasy. His life and liberty were promised to him if he would only acknowledge that Christ was merely man, and that Mohammed was the messenger of God. On refusing, he is imprisoned, and finds in prison a certain Solomon, also charged with apostasy from Islam. The two fellow prisoners contract a great friendship, and are consequently separated. After a third exhortation, they are condemned to death, but not before the judge had done his best to bribe them to forego their purpose by offers of honor and rewards. They were executed March 13, 857, and their bodies thrown into the river, even the stones sprinkled with their blood being taken up and cast into the water, lest the Christians should preserve them as relics. Ruderick's body was washed on shore, fresh as when killed, while Solomon, not being equally fortunate, informed a devout Christian in a vision where his body lay in a tamarisk thicket near the town of Nymphianum. Hitherto, the aider and abettor of these martyrdoms had himself contrived to escape the penalty which he had urged others to brave. Whether this was due to any unworthy fear of death on his part is not clear, but it may have been owing to the respect in which he was held by the Muslim authorities. To these he was well known as a man of irreproachable character and unaffected piety, and several Arabs of high rank, who were his personal friends, showed themselves anxious to screen him from the effects of his folly. Eulogius was descended from a senatorial family of Cordova, and was educated at the church of St. Zoilus, where he devoted himself to ecclesiastical studies and soon surpassed his contemporaries in learning. With his friend Alvar, he sat at the feet of Sperandio, an eminent abbot in the province of Baetica. Besides a sister, Anulo, Eulogius had two brothers engaged in trade, and another brother, Joseph, who seems to have been in government employ. Eulogius became early noted for his practice of asceticism and his desire for the life of a monk and for the glory of martyrdom. When strong measures were taken by the authorities, in concert with Recafridis, Bishop of Seville, to stamp out the mania for martyrdom by threats, stripes, and imprisonment, though many were frightened into submission, Eulogius, Alvar tells us, remained firm in spite of his being singled out as an incenter martyrum by a certain Gomez, who was a temporizing Christian in the king's service. There is no doubt that Eulogius did all he could to interfere with and check that amalgamation of the Christians and Arabs which he saw going on round him. Believing that such close relations between the peoples tended to the spiritual degradation of Christianity, he set himself deliberately to embitter those relations and, as far as he could, to make a good understanding impossible. To discourage the learning of Arabic by the Christians, he brought back with him from a journey to Pamplona the classical writings of Virgil, Horace, Juvenal, and Augustine's De Civitate Dei. At the time when these martyrdoms took place, Eulogius was a priest, but for some reason he tried to abstain from officiating at the Mass on the ground that he was himself a great sinner. However, his ecclesiastical superior, Saul, Bishop of Cordova, soon made him take a different view of the question by threatening him with anathema if he neglected his duty any longer. Coming forward as a prominent champion of the extreme party in the church, he was imprisoned in 851, where he wrote treatises in favor of the martyrs, and was released, as we have seen, by the intercession of Flora and Maria on November 29th of that year. In 858, on the death of Wistremius, he was chosen by the votes of the people to succeed him as Bishop of Toledo, but from some cause, perhaps by the intervention of the Muslims, he was prevented from occupying his see. The people then determined to have no bishop, if they might not have him. Yet, adds the pious Alvar, he got his bishopric after all, for all holy men are bishops, though not all bishops holy men. In the following year, he was again imprisoned as being a disturber of the public peace, but as on a former occasion he had been allowed to support and encourage Flora and Maria, so now was he permitted to finish in prison a book in defense of the martyrs, which had the direct tendency of inciting others to go and do likewise. The occasion of Eulogius's second imprisonment was as follows. Leocretia, a maiden of Arab extraction and of noble birth, had been secretly baptized by Liliosa, the wife of Felix. Her parents, learning her apostasy, cruelly ill-treated and even beat her in order to make her renounce Christ. She naturally turned to Eulogius and his sister Anulo for advice in her afflictions, expressing a wish to escape to a part of Spain where the Christian worship was free. As a first step to this, she leaves her parents under pretense of going to a wedding and takes refuge with Eulogius. Her parents, furious at her escape, get all sorts of people imprisoned on the charge of aiding her, and she is at last betrayed and surprised at the house of her protector. They are both dragged before the Cadi, who asks Eulogius angrily why he persists in defying the laws in this way. The bishop defends himself by pleading that Christian clergy are bound to impart a knowledge of their religion, if asked, as he had been by Leocretia. The judge then threatens to have him scourged, but Eulogius, preferring death to so painful and degrading a punishment, repeats the lesson which he had taught to so many others, and reviles Muhammad. Even so, the judge shows a disposition to treat him with leniency, and he is remanded to prison with Leocretia. When brought up again before the royal council, an influential friend makes a last effort to say him, saying, "Fools and idiots rush on their own destruction, but what induces you, a man of approved wisdom and blameless character, in defiance of all natural instincts, to throw away your life in this manner?" He urges Eulogius to say but one word of concession in the hour of peril, promising that he should afterwards be free to exercise his religion as he pleased, without let or hindrance. But the bishop could hardly turn back now, and he rejected all such offers with the ejaculation, "If they only knew the joy that awaits us on high." On his way to execution, when struck by one of the bystanders on one cheek, he turned the other meekly to the striker. He was beheaded on March 11, 859, and Leocretia 4 days later. Miraculous appearances honored the body of the martyred bishop, which was buried in the church of St. Genesius, whence it was translated in the next year to his own church of St. Zoilus, and in 883 was given up together with that of Leocretia to Alfonso III, 866 to 910, by express stipulation.